In the muddy spring of 1829, a plowman on the Delaware-Maryland line felt his horse vanish up to the chest, like the earth had taken a breath and swallowed. The furrow caved, board splintered, and a wooden trunk blinked at the daylight for the first time in years. Inside, bone the color of candle wax, a skull with a story beaten into it, and the first whisper of a name locals had only said behind closed doors, Martha Bell. They called that crossroads a nowhere place, a seam where 3 counties met and no sheriffs wanted their boots dirty. Pines pressed close, marsh breath rose sweet and rotted, and the Nanticoke ran black and quiet as a held secret. There was a tavern out there, the kind with a back room in one state and a front door in another, jurisdiction like a parlor trick. People drank, made deals, left lighter than they came. Some left without their names. The trunk was only the start. Once the ground agrees to speak, it doesn't stop. One grave wakes the next, one bone points to another. And behind it all, a woman with a face people remembered and a past carefully folded. Martha Bell, tall as a hired man, voice like a door hinge, hands that knew kitchens and corfles, ink and iron. For years she worked the border like a loom, stitching routes no mapmaker would claim. She didn't just steal bodies into the deep south. She erased lives, witnesses, rivals, children too young to understand why the world had tilted. What the papers politely called kidnapping was something colder and older. After Congress outlawed the transatlantic trade, cotton still screamed for hands. Prices soared. The South had money. The borderlands had people no court would defend. That's where Bell lived, in the gap between law and ledger, where a forged pass was a death sentence and a promise of work was a snare. We are going to walk that road tonight. We are stepping into the tavern that straddled 2 states. We are opening floorboards locals swore were cursed. We are following the ink trails of constables who looked away, and of one betrayed boy who finally pointed to the dirt and said, "Dig there." But first, tell me where you're listening from. Drop your city or state in the comments. Did stories like this pass through your town, too? Quiet, like smoke under a door. And if you want more unsanitized history, names, dates, and the dark rooms in between, tap subscribe and ring the bell. These are the chapters power tried to bury. We dig them up together. Ready? The trunk is open. The air smells like damp wood and old coins. The next spade of earth will uncover a second chest, and a pattern. Authorities will say fever, then accident, then nothing at all. Martha Bell will keep smiling that tight little smile she practiced in the bar mirror. And one witness, too young to be anything but owned, will start learning the shape of courage. They said the tavern could slide out from under the law if it needed to. Front door in Delaware. Backstep in Maryland. A trap door that didn't open to any state at all. By daylight, it was a way station. Muddy boots, wagon grease, travelers arguing over weather and price. After dusk, the candles burned lower and deals rewrote themselves. Names crossed out, ages adjusted, family ties bleached from a page. The room itself helped. Boards were thick, sound died in the grain, and the fireplace cowled a draft that hid whispers. Martha Bell ran that room like a conductor. She liked to stand half in shadow, hands folded, listening. New faces learned to look away first. Regulars, drivers, drovers, rivermen knew her nods. A nod meant another round, or that a man should step outside, or that a particular pair of eyes needed to be on the road by moonrise. She knew who carried money. She knew who carried papers. She knew which young men were proud of their free status and carried it like a lantern, exactly the kind of light she liked to snuff. Her business adapted to the nation's greed. When the ship stopped bringing shackled cargo from Africa, the Cotton Kingdom didn't go quiet. It just turned its pockets out and called it progress. Prices swelled. Middlemen multiplied. And on the Delmarva seam, people vanished between 1 mile marker and the next. Sometimes it was a promise of work. Georgia's hiring. Mississippi too. We'll have you back by harvest. Sometimes it was a midnight knock. Sometimes it was a forged past pressed into a frightened palm and a smile that didn't reach the eyes. You're safe if you keep moving. Beneath the common room, a cellar with more corners than a square needs. Rings bolted at ankle height. Bricks arranged to drink sound. A chute off the far wall that could take a person from one cellar to another without ever touching daylight. Martha said little in those rooms. The gang did the talking, men with quick hands and practiced lies. She preferred to read ledgers upstairs, lists of bodies turned to currency. Girl, 15. Boy, likely 17. Man, strong back. Woman, seamstress, as if ink could flatten a life. It is easy to call it just kidnapping. Easier still to call it trade. But the truth at that tavern was older and meaner. It was appetite, sharpened by law, hidden by distance, and organized by a woman who had discovered that the quietest person in the room often controlled the room. The road out of her yard pointed south. The river knew the way by heart. And the border, well, the border had learned to look away. The network had a pulse. You could feel it if you stood by the Nanticoke long enough, if you listened to the water hold its breath for an or stroke, a muffled order, a sob bitten off so it wouldn't be heard. Martha's people mapped routes the way surveyors mapped land, where a marsh could hide a wagon, where a ferryman would keep his hat down and his fee up, where a turnpike toll could be talked around at 3 a.m. with a handshake and a promise to remember a favor later. She did not work alone. A yellow man, the records would later say, a mixed-race scout with 3 names and 4 hats, walked the alleys of Philadelphia, the wharves of Wilmington, the back streets of Dover. He knew which boarding houses took in free families with papers and dreams. He could speak hope in a dozen accents. Beside him moved 2 white brothers with corn-fed faces and knife-calloused thumbs, men who could pass as escorts, employers, cousins. And tethered to them all, a boy, thin, quick, owned, who watched everything and said nothing. We will come back to him. The reverse Underground Railroad, historians would call it later, trying to capture the sting of it in terminology, but names can't carry weight like that. It wasn't a railroad. It was a river that ran backward through people's lives, unmaking them. One woman, taken at a pump where she'd gone for water, woke under pine boards to the smell of damp iron and other people's breath. A man leaving a prayer meeting stepped into a coach and never touched a church threshold again. Children disappeared walking between a grandmother's kitchen and the back step. And always, the promise, wages on the other end, something stable, a roof. Lies built like scaffolding around a truth nobody would admit. The South would buy, and the border would sell. Martha kept 2 books. One was for show, the Tavern Slow Winter, the Spring Flower Order, the barrels kegged and paid. The other was kept by ear and memory. In it, a cluster of routes pulsed like veins. Johnson's Crossroads to Vienna to Cambridge, Elkton to Blackbird to the Sassafras, the straight, dangerous line to the Chesapeake ferries. She altered paths after every rumor of a constable with a spine or a mayor in Philadelphia who started asking questions. When the heat rose, she moved people through the pine at dusk, horses shod in leather, wagon wheels wrapped in canvas, dogs bribed to sleep. If anyone asked too many questions at the tavern, if a stranger's gaze held too long, Martha's face went kindly blank. We are quiet folk here, she'd say. Just wet land and long roads. Her voice could be a quilt, heavy, muffling, meant to keep the cold questions out. Then, when the stranger blinked, her men would step in between. The conversation would slide. The lamp would go out early. And by morning, the stranger would either be gone, or had learned the border's oldest rule. You can ask anything you like. Answers cost extra. People argued about where Martha came from. Canada, some said, with a girlhood under snow and hard fathers. Others swore Maryland birth, cornfields and river mud under her nails since she could walk. The records wouldn't agree. Martha made sure of that. She learned early that a blurred birthplace keeps a woman's past from being tied to her ankle. What is certain, by the time her name mattered, she'd married a quiet farmer with more land than sense and a daughter as beautiful as a promise. The husband died, some said fever, Some said a spoon in the stew. And grief looked good on Martha for about a week. After that, the black dress became an apron, then a uniform. The daughter chose poorly, or perfectly, depending on whether you measure character by profit. First a blacksmith who travelled more than he hammered, whose horseshoes and lies were both well-shaped. Then, after a rope found his neck on the courthouse yard, a second husband with a tavern planted like a flag on the exact line where law gets thin. Men like that don't marry for love, they marry for location. Martha didn't mind. Her family tree was pruning itself into exactly the shape she needed, a trunk called Bell, a branch named Johnson, and below them, an orchard of bad fruit ready to drop coin. Martha did not drink. She let others dull themselves while she sharpened. She saved her indulgence for control, the pleasure of names in a list and lines drawn between them, the thrill of closing two doors at once, the one leading to rescue and the one that would have let fear out. She could be patient as drought. 15 months to cultivate a ferryman. 2 years to turn a deputy's debt into silence. She could be sudden, too. One word to a man at her bar, and a traveller's luck turned to night. Murder came, eventually, like a habit learned by practice. A trader from Georgia, fat with money and arrogance, boasted under her rafters. He didn't see her counting his sins, one by one, against the weight of his purse and the value of his absence. He didn't see the nod. He didn't hear the floor learn the exact measure of his fall. The ground took him without complaint, and a pine box slid into a rectangle of earth that had been waiting as calmly as a well. People told themselves stories to make that kinder. Maybe he ran off. Maybe he sailed. Maybe he deserved it. Martha let them guess. Rumor is cheaper than justice. Her smile in the bar mirror never reached her eyes. She ironed her apron the way soldiers sharpen bayonets. Ritual, attention, readiness. The house learned her footstep and never creaked in the wrong place when she walked. Children in a radius of 20 miles learned to cut through fields rather than pass her door. And men who should have known better learned the little surrenders. First a favor, then a lie, then an errand at midnight. That turned into membership in a circle there's no resigning from except into the ground. Law here was a patchwork quilt with the batting missing. A constable's badge didn't buy him boldness in a pine stand at midnight. County lines bent like a rumor. Roads scribbled across them like a child's hand. If a Delaware warrant arrived in Martha's yard, the Maryland door swung open and swallowed whoever it needed to. If Maryland came nosing, the Delaware hearth gave off a comfortable, law-abiding heat. "Show me your paper," Martha would say, and men who thought they were the law suddenly needed to reread their own warrants. But there were exceptions, men too stubborn to shrug and go home. A Quaker mayor in Philadelphia, more unshakable than polite, started collecting names like river stones. He wrote them in a ledger that didn't lie. Lydia, who never came back from buying thread, Daniel taken between the dock and his doorstep, 3 children, siblings, who vanished on a road that led past a tavern with 2 flags and 1 owner. He offered rewards that mattered. He sent letters that traveled farther than fear. He put pressure on sheriffs who preferred to count chickens and keep the peace by not counting the missing. Martha adapted, like a snake that learns the shape of a new basket. Routes changed by inches. A friendly magistrate got a pig fattened before market day. A ferryman's wife found her debts forgiven. A deputy's son got a job at the bar, sweeping, listening, learning which questions not to ask. The tavern kept serving stew. The cellar kept its breath shallow. And the roads kept eating footsteps. Free papers, those fragile shields, became weapons for the wrong side. Martha collected them like trophies, rolled them tight and tied them with ribbon, tucked them in a drawer that smelled of lavender and theft. When a buyer in Mississippi asked for proof that a man was legally held, Martha would simply produce the opposite: silence. No papers. No identity. A new name assigned like a number, a past smudged with a thumb. This one knows boats. That one's strong. This girl sings, teach her to mend. If the law did come with its spine up, Martha could be all sugar. "We keep a clean house," she would say, offering bread. "You're welcome to look, sir. We've nothing to hide." And for a few minutes, that might even be true. At that exact moment, the cellar would be empty. The hidden room would be a pantry. The transport wagon would be 3 miles away under a top that smelled of hay and rain. The deputy would leave with polite apologies. And that night, the road south would learn more names. The graves began with money and ended with habit. The Georgia trader was only the first. A man from Savannah with a ledger in his pocket came next, the paper crisp, the ink wet with plans right up until the moment it met the tavern's darkest corner. He should have kept riding. He should have slept under his wagon. But coin made him brave, and whiskey made him foolish. The room listened as he listed what he owned. Martha listened too, then quietly revised the list. It was never messy, not the way people imagine violence. The house had rules for that. Doors shut, candles snuffed, a rope that left no story behind on the skin, a single report that the pine boards drank and never belched back, and after, a chest measured to a human shape, nails driven steady, a path across the yard learned by heart to avoid a squeak in the gate. The earth turned back over like a page. The night, indifferent, laid itself down over everything. People asked, later, why she killed the men who could have been her customers. They were, for a time. But Martha did arithmetic with lives. A trader with $30 becomes a danger. A trader with $3,000 becomes a target. His absence ripples for weeks. Partners whisper, wives fret, clerks invent stories. Then the mud closes and the mail keeps moving and the cotton keeps crying for hands. The market, hungry, forgiving, forgets him. Martha counted on that. The graves did not hold only men with pockets. Sometimes the earth took people who had nothing except knowledge. A woman who saw too much moving past her window. A boy who recognized a face from the city and said a name aloud when he should have swallowed it. Secrets have to be fed to stay tame, and Martha fed hers to the ground like kitchen scraps to a hog, without ceremony, without pause, without looking back over her shoulder as she walked away. In the mornings, the tavern was laughter again. Eggs and ash, men spitting into the fireplace and arguing about which road would dry fastest after the rain. Martha's daughter filled mugs. Martha wiped counters. Someone tuned a fiddle for the evening. It was all ordinary, deliberately so, as if ordinariness itself were a cloak. The house creaked contentedly as the sun warmed its spine. Underneath, the cellar kept cool. And beneath that, boxes lay square and silent while roots curled around them like fingers. He was a boy when she bought him, old enough to run fast, young enough to be told his name didn't belong to him anymore. He grew in the shadow of the tavern's eaves and learned the house like a second skin. He carried wood, fetched water, kept his head down. But eyes learn even when you tell them not to. He saw who came at dusk and who never left by dawn. He learned the weight of a ring bolt in his hand. He learned which boards were loose and which would betray a footstep. Martha used him as a lure because children don't frighten people. "Help me lift this," he'd ask a man with a free pass in his pocket. "Mama sent me to fetch you," he'd tell a woman at a pump, eyes big, voice high, and the woman, kind because that's who she'd always been, would lean too close to hear the rest. He hated the words even as he said them. Hate is a skill. He became fluent. He also learned to count. Not money. He rarely touched that, but hours. How long someone stayed below before a door opened. How many days between wagons. How many nights Martha didn't sleep. He learned to listen through a floor. Damp would carry sound in secrets. Metal on stone. A cough bitten in half. A word like tomorrow said with a kind of relief that made his stomach hurt. And he learned horror. Not the lurid, noisy kind, but the flat variety that arrives quietly when a too small shape under a blanket stops moving, when a bundle disappears out a side door and the house does not speak of it again, when a woman's lullaby in the cellar thins and then ends because endings are safer for business than continuity. He learned that sometimes silence is a choice other people make for you. He also learned courage in small, breakable pieces. It began with a pebble. One slipped beneath a foundation rock to mark a place. Then a nail scratched into a beam. He started to map the house in a language only his hands knew. When men bragged upstairs, he tucked away their names the way he tucked away kindling. When women whispered downstairs, he memorized their hometowns. He could not stop the wagon wheels. He could not turn the river. But he could gather a storm inside himself and wait. The storm needed a lightning strike. It came when a stranger from Philadelphia came to the tavern with eyes that saw too much and a letter that named 3 missing people and the precise street each had stood on the last time they were themselves. He asked the boy a question that no one had asked him before. "Do you want this to stop?" The boy's mouth went dry. He could not say yes. He did not say no. The stranger left a coin on the table. It was the first coin anyone had ever given the boy that wasn't a command. That night, when Martha slept, the boy lifted a loose board and hid the coin in the dust like a seed. The ground gave way in April, as if winter finally loosened its jaw. The tenant farmer cursed, pried the board, and found a chest heave itself into daylight. The sheriff came, hat in hand, trying to look like a man who'd been expecting this. He hadn't. The justice of the peace tried not to gag at the smell of damp wood and old wrong. Word went up the line like smoke. By sundown, men with shovels were standing at the tavern fence looking relieved to have orders to dig and scared of what digging means. The boy watched from the kitchen door. He knew where to point: garden, far corner, by the ash stump, the hollow where the pine always grew greener than it should. He did not rush. He named the places like prayers, steady, one by one, to keep himself from breaking. When a constable asked how he knew, he said, "I was told to carry," and the constable nodded as if that were an answer, because men like that are always looking for reasons that let them sleep later. The cellar was a revelation to men who thought they knew rooms. They discovered the second wall behind the first, the false pantry panel that clicked if you pressed your thumb in just the right place. They found the ring bolts, cold and ordinary. They found the ventilation shaft disguised as a dry well. "She planned this," one whispered, as if planning were the worst of it. Another found the drawer with the lavender-smelling papers, the proof of freedom stolen and tied up like keepsakes. He set them on the table as carefully as you place a sleeping baby, as if gentle hands could reverse time. They dug. The shovels gasped in roots. The men tried to keep their breathing even. Boxes came up dark and dripping, the nails blooming rust. Each one a story with its final pages torn out. "A child," the boy said, voice low. "Another," he said, lifting his palm to stop a shovel that was about to bite where it shouldn't. "A man with a scar over his eye." Their certainty unnerved the officers. The boy spoke like a ledger. Women from the nearest farm brought water and the kind of quiet that keeps a scene from cracking. Local men held their hats against their chests in a posture that looked like respect and felt like disbelief. Martha stood on the stoop, lips tight, eyes flat as slate. "We host travelers," she said. "Who knows what men bring with them?" she added, as if human remains hid themselves under her garden without her permission. Night came with lanterns. Crowds came with questions. The house sighed and remembered how to be a structure without secrets. But the yard, full of holes, full of boxes, full of the sudden realization that the border had been bleeding people for years, felt like a confession finally coaxed from a mouth that had practiced silence too long. The courthouse smelled like paper and dust and men who decided to be brave at last. The Attorney General himself rode down, coat still bearing the road's grit, jaw set. He took statements from farmers whose knees shook and from a boy whose didn't. He wrote charges on thick paper so the ink would bite deep. 4 counts of murder to start, specific dates, small bodies included, as if naming them in ink would give them back their names. A grand jury, 24 white men who'd rather have been in their fields, filed into a room and listened to the litany. A trader from Georgia, gone a decade, a garden plot that yielded a child, 2 more boxes, one with bones too small to be anything but cruel. They shifted in their chairs. Some scowled to hide the shiver. All of them scribbled their names on a document that finally called Martha Bell what she'd always been, an answerable thing. The jail in Georgetown was not made for a woman like her. It held drunks and debtors and men who'd lost fights. Now it learned to hold quiet, too. Martha requested nothing except a chair with a back and enough light to see her hands. Visitors came, the merely curious, the morbid, the men who'd cut deals with her suddenly desperate to see how undoable those deals were. She looked at each, measured them as she always had, and behaved as if she was still the one offering terms. Reporters came from Philadelphia and Baltimore with notebooks too small for the story. "Is it true?" they asked guards. "Did she?" They didn't finish their questions. Guards pretended not to know the answers. It's easier that way in towns that have to keep living near the places where horrors happened. Martha spoke when it suited her. She called what she'd done business. She called bodies loss. She called the boy a liar. She said the men who went missing had moved on. She said children get sick. She said just enough truth to make the lies wear borrowed clothes. When one reporter asked if she felt remorse, she put her head to one side like a woman trying to hear a distant bell and said, "For what?" On paper, it moved fast. Trial in weeks, hanging after. The community rehearsed the feeling of a verdict like a hymn they'd never sung before. The boy learned to sleep without dreaming and failed, but kept trying. The Attorney General practiced his closing in the mirror and flinched only once, when he said the murdered child and heard his own voice crack. The tavern stood empty for the first time in years, doors barred, chimney cold, as if it were holding its breath to see if a house with that many secrets can survive the truth. The morning the guards found her, the jail was as quiet as a pond at dawn. No one had heard a struggle. No one had heard a prayer. Martha lay on the floor, one hand turned palm up like she was about to ask for something and thought better of it. They said poison later, because naming a thing helps you believe you understand it. A vial in her dress gave them a story. Arsenic, smuggled in past a lazy search, or hoarded from a medicine cabinet no one monitored, because who expects a 70-year-old woman to be more dangerous with a pinch of powder than with a gun? The town reacted like a body that stubs its toe, a bark of pain, then a dull throb of disappointment. Justice, so rehearsed in whispers and imagined headlines, slipped away at the last second. No trial. No verdict. No rope on the courthouse green to draw a final line under years of fear. Martha had kept control of the last page. People hated her for that almost as much as for everything else. Her co-conspirators made themselves scarce in the way men like that do. One brother headed south. Another vanished across a river with a new name and old habits. The mixed-race scout grew a beard, shaved it, dyed his hair, and finally learned to settle only by never settling anywhere too long. The tavern's daughter boarded the windows and left under a sky that refused to look different for her sake. Only the boy remained, not because he wanted to, but because leaving is hard when the world has always called you property. The Attorney General argued for mercy and something like protection. A judge nodded, moved by the combination of usefulness and youth. Papers were drafted. Chains came off his ankles, then his wrists, with a sound he dreamed of and thought he would never hear. People in a nearby city who believed in the future more than the past found him work with his hands and a room with a lock he controlled from the inside. He carried a map in his head he could never set down. Years later, when someone asked him how to move people unseen through woods and over water, he lifted his finger and traced air the way he once traced dirt. He pointed out ferries that asked no questions and roads that took you 1 mile farther than you thought you could go. He did not say the names of the dead out loud because his voice still didn't trust itself not to break when it had to carry that much weight. The tavern lost its sign to the wind. The road learned a different route. The garden grew wild, defiant weeds reclaiming rows that remembered other harvests. The graves, exhumed, examined, reinterred, became a rumor again because people can only hold so much fact before they start setting it down. But the border didn't forget. Borders never do. They just wait for the next person who thinks lines on a map can hide anything. It is easy to make this a single woman story, an evil face we can point to so the system's reflection doesn't trouble us too much. But the ledger doesn't allow it. The profits did not stack only in one drawer. The routes did not stay open without many hands keeping them clear. The laws did not fail by accident. They failed because they were made to look the other way when they vanished with the wrong color, the wrong class, the wrong names in the wrong mouths. Cotton's numbers climb in the same years the missing do. A barrel of whiskey changes its destination the same week a ferryman's debt disappears. A deputy's boy buys a new coat the same season the tavern's roses bloom too darkly. Price lists in New Orleans, prime field hand, house girl, boy quick with boats, are as much part of this story as a shovel in a Delaware yard. Martha is a face the system wore. She didn't invent appetite. She learned to feed it efficiently. After she died, the town tried to rename itself into Cleanliness, Johnson's Crossroads into Reliance, as if rely could overwrite betray. The old jail yard became a parking lot. Her bones were moved. Her skull, separated, displayed, passed from hand to hand for years like a carnival trick, turned human cruelty into a conversation piece. People shook their heads over it, tutted, and then put it back under glass and went on with their day. Memory made manageable. But the other bones, the ones without plaques, did not get such attention. Most of their names were never recorded. The ledger that mattered burned in the fireplace of a house with too many secrets. Families in Philadelphia, Wilmington, Baltimore, and a farmer's lane outside Dover waited past reasonable seasons, then stopped waiting, learning the brutal skill of making a life around a hole no one would admit was there. Law changed in tiny, grinding ways. A mayor's letters turned into an interstate meeting. An interstate meeting turned into a governor's directive. A directive became a precedent that later men could point to when they needed to say, "You can't cross a line to kill a case." But change dripped, slow as sap, and in the meantime roads kept running and markets kept yawning wide. Martha's house fell, finally, plank by plank, sold for salvage and silence. People brought their children to the site and told them the story the way you tell a caution. Don't walk alone. Don't trust anyone. Don't be proud. They rarely said, don't build systems that make it profitable to erase people. That lesson sits harder. It requires more than a nod and a tighter hand on a child's wrist. It requires looking at a map and asking what it hides on purpose. If you stand at the edge of the old yard at dusk, the frogs are loud enough to swallow thought. The pines lean in like gossips. The marsh sighs. The house is gone, but absence is an architecture too. Ghost foundations tracing where rooms once held breath. People say they've seen a light there, small and stubborn, not from any lantern. People say the ground feels softer in rectangles that don't match a gardener's plan, as if the earth refuses to firm up over certain truths. Children dare each other to step into the old cellar mouth, now just a depression where rain gathers. They expect a thrill, a chill. What they feel instead is a weight, as if the air itself remembers being forced to carry sound it did not want. Old men spit and say the place is bad luck. Women bring flowers in spring and lay them where the garden ran richest, not because memorials change the past, but because respect is a habit that keeps the present from rotting. Stories shift over time because that's how people protect themselves. Martha becomes larger, then smaller. The number of victims swells, then shrinks, then swells again. Heroes are added where there were none to make the story easier to carry. Villains are simplified so we don't have to think about how ordinary the hands were that made extraordinary harm possible. The boy becomes a man in some tellings, a shadow in others. In all versions, he points. In all versions, digging follows. If you listen closely, you can hear an echo that has nothing to do with ghosts, the echo of routes reversed. The same roads that took people south later learned to carry them north at night, guided by different hands and different maps and men and women who used courage the way others use coin. Maybe the boy helped. Maybe he only showed a younger person where a creek runs shallow enough to cross without lifting your hem. Maybe that was enough. We tell this story not to linger in horror, though horror is here and should not be rushed past. We tell it because forgetting is the easiest kind of complicity, and because names, once spoken, are harder to erase. We tell it so the next time a place looks ordinary, plough horse, pine stand, a room with a hearth, we remember to ask who is missing and why the room is so quiet when it should be noisier with the lives still in it. The border is still there. Jurisdictions still knit together with crooked thread. Markets still make appetites look respectable. But people, listening, reading, refusing to let the old maps be the only maps, make other routes possible. If a boy could draw a house from the inside out and turn that drawing into a way out for others, what can a community draw together, now, in daylight? The spring of 1829 ended with a burial and a beginning. Martha Bell went into the ground without ceremony, the way she'd put others there. The tavern lost its voice. The yard kept its scars. The papers printed columns that made readers feel like justice had happened, even though justice had slipped quietly out a side door the night before with a pinch of powder in a vial. People argue about that still, whether death before trial was a thief or a last, bitter gift. The dead do not weigh in. But something else began. Men who'd shrugged learned to stiffen their backs when a stranger asked for a signature without a proper seal. Ferrymen discovered a taste for refusing coin that smelled like fear. A mayor's ledger became a city's resolve. In church basements and behind parlor doors, people said names out loud and wrote them twice, and when those names went missing, they did not pretend it was weather or fate. They asked. They kept asking. They followed the questions to places where roads pretend to end. As for the boy, he became a man whose steps were quiet not because he was hiding, but because moving softly gets you heard by those who need to hear you. He married, or didn't. He had children, or he taught them. He kept a map in his hands, invisible to everyone except the next person who needed it. When he died with the door locked from the inside, a small miracle no archivist can footnote, but all of us should count. The land at the crossroads changed its name as if words could whitewash a yard. Reliance, they called it. Rely on what, exactly? On people choosing to be better than the past taught them to be. On communities refusing to sell their silences. On the stubborn truth that the dead ask one thing from the living, to be remembered with their full weight. So, what do you make of this? Do you think the digging we did tonight unearthed everything? Or are there still chests under the pine roots and ledgers in kitchen drawers that never saw daylight? Were Martha's roots her invention alone, or a visible strand of a much larger web that stretched farther than the Mason-Dixon and lasted longer than anyone wanted to admit? Tell me what you see between the lines. If this journey gripped you, if the lantern light of recovered history matters, stay with us. Comment where you're listening from, and if your town has a road people avoid after dark because of what it remembers. Share this with someone who believes the past is tidy. Let them hear how noisy it really is. And if you want more names rescued from margins, more nights when we stand at the edge of the map and step anyway, tap subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss when we go digging again. This has been Tales Never Told. History is written by the comfortable. We tell the stories the ground wouldn't keep quiet. I'll see you in the next one. Keep your lanterns lit.